Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding and welcome to episode 5 of my Road to the Arnold Classic series. We're continuing to move through this series and today we have our first repeat athlete. Carlos Thomas Jr. has already debuted in my series, but not under very good circumstance. But today I think I have a much more favorable matchup for him. Today, Carlos, a very new athlete, will be going up against the veteran big Akim Williams. This is actually one of the matchups I'm looking forward to the most as these guys are incredibly similar. How similar? Well, let's find out. For the versions of each athlete used today, unfortunately my options were limited. I'm using Carlos's only pro show appearance, the 2023 Texas Pro, and yes, I will address this later on. But Akim won't be using his current best either, which is a show that he won at the end of last year, the Big Man Weekend. I'd love to use that version for Akim, but literally look at the lighting. Who the lights a show like this? But don't worry too much as Akim competed just a week prior to that event in Romania, which had much better lighting, so we'll be using that version. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into today's video. If you guys like these types of videos and want to see more of this series, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Be prepared for a lot of close wins in this comparison. As said, Akim and Carlos are very similar. Here in the front double, they both have good proportions, a lot of mass, and great arms. Akim has two main advantages though, not just here in this pose, but ones that'll be a factor throughout this comparison. One, he's tall, and Carlos is not. Akim is also a tall guy with a very filled out frame. I know a lot of people say height doesn't matter in bodybuilding, but if a guy isn't missing size, then extra height only helps. And it helps Akim look very powerful and imposing in this shot. The second advantage for Akim is his conditioning. He's a lot sharper and a heck of a lot drier than one Carlos Thomas Jr. But what is Carlos doing right? He wins the legs probably, even though Akim's are sharper, so that does make it close, but I could go either way. Carlos is a lot bigger though. Akim also has an imbalance between his legs, which is distracting. Carlos wins in the torso too, which is probably the most important area to win in this shot. Sure, Akim has a small waist, but with his high lats, his torso just looks kind of empty. Carlos has a smaller waist too, but much better lats, so he has a lot better flow and a better V-taper. And finally in the arms, Carlos has these nice full biceps, but Akim has my vote in this area. I'm a big fan of his arms, with the crazy peaks and the striations in there. Overall, I think a lot of this does come down to personal preference. Carlos is less refined, but has better flow, and Akim is big, imposing, and much more shredded. It's a coin toss, I can't fault you either way, but once again, Akim gets my vote this time for an overall win. Can I explain it though? No, not really, I just really like Akim. The front lat spread is another close one. Again, I like Carlos more in the legs. Akim's in this pose look a little bit small, but then again, he is definitely drier and in better condition. And that doesn't just go for the legs, it goes for upstairs too. But I think the biggest and pretty much only other differentiating factor here is the namesake of the pose, the lats. Carlos is good, but Akim is even better. I don't really have any other analysis here besides that. So go the lats, so goes the pose. Narrowly though, because that is literally the only difference. I want to mention my judging system here too. I give out 1, 2, or 3-point wins depending on how big a win is in a particular pose. This pose here is an obvious 1-pointer since these guys really aren't that different, and the last pose was also a coin flip and that will be worth just 1 point as well, both for Akim. Now here's an interesting one. Here in the side chest, it's like we're looking at the change in the guard in real time. For years, Akim has had some of the best side shots in the entire world. He is still top 3 to this day if you ask me, especially if you consider both side poses as a collective. However, Carlos is on the cusp of breaking into that list as well. Very soon, I think Akim and others will be passing the torch to guys like Carlos, but today is not that day. And that's for one reason, condition. Carlos is bigger in the side leg, but is he better? I wouldn't say so. I would narrowly give this to Akim, who has no trouble in the size department but is by far more detailed. It's not just condition either, it's that years of heavy and hard training kicking in as well. Akim's muscle maturity is extremely good at this point. Moving to the upper limb, I do like Carlos here a bit more, he's just a bit fuller, but Akim takes the delt as he's bigger here. That rear delt is especially great. And that brings us to the pecs. Carlos is fuller, but Akim is hanging in there with a very thick chest himself, and the more detailed chest too. I do prefer Carlos's pecs to Akim's, but I think it's really neck and neck. Overall, this is kind of like a size versus detail debate, but it's actually more like a size versus detail and enough size debate. Carlos is short, stout, and he looks maxed out, which is a good thing for this pose. But Akim might look just as impressive because he's taller and still very thickly developed. Realistically, he has all the size you could want, but better details. So with this equation, I believe the answer is an Akim win. A small 1-point win, with the detail being the ultimate decider. I will note, however, that the guard could change in an instant. Watch this one on show day. If Carlos just gets 10% sharper, there could be a new sheriff in town. Okay, so how the actual am I supposed to score this pose? This is another reason these guys are so similar. They both have some of the worst back development I've ever seen. Literally, there's nothing to judge in the back. So I thought about two ways I could go about this. One, I can just go with who's more conditioned. This pose is about detail after all, and things like the upper and lower limbs can be judged and judged mainly on condition. Or I could just try to judge it as normal and try to make an attempt to see who's better here. Honestly, with backs like these, I think pretty much anything could be considered the deciding factor and it be justified. It's completely arbitrary at this point. But I decided to do something completely unprecedented and not waste any more time. This is the Arnold Classic series after all, and we should be pulling out all the stops. For the first time in Project Bodybuilding history, I am making this a tie. I never do ties in the mandatory section of the scorecard. I think there is pretty much always a deciding factor, and sure, maybe there is one here. I outlined two scenarios I could use to find a winner, but I think this is a special case. Truly, some of the worst back development I've ever seen. Now this back pose, the rear lat spread, is a bit better for both guys, but really what does that say? Even here, I really wouldn't say either guy has even an average pose. I don't like either of them. Akim is still really struggling with his high lats here. He has a great amount of width at the top of his back, but pretty much no taper. But he does have a thicker, more detailed back. And Akim is technically wider than Carlos at their peak widths. However, width shouldn't be the end-all be-all, especially in a situation like this. Akim is wider, yes, but he has no taper, all while Carlos has a really uniformly developed back and taper. He has that proper shield look while Akim looks like a palm tree. The lower body might even go to Carlos. Yes, Akim is sharper, but is he that much sharper? It really doesn't look like it. And Carlos is a lot bigger overall cast the glutes. I think you could really just take your pick here because they are both far from perfect, but for my money I'm going with Carlos. And that is simply because I hate Akim's back shape. I don't really think that's being nitpicky either. A back is not supposed to look like that. This will just be a 1-point win for Carlos though, and if I did end up giving this to Akim, it also would have been a 1 point in that direction. So overall, the back poses are so bad they have really no impact on this comparison. We have the side tricep now, and yeah, this is a pretty bad photo for Carlos, but it's the best I could find. Still, even with this quality of photo, I think there's some pretty basic things that we can infer. Detail is once again the most obvious thing. Like in the side chest, Akim is more detailed everywhere. That wins in the side leg for starters. Then in the upper body, I want to take note of how Carlos kind of flattens out compared to his side chest pose where he was looking massive. He just doesn't have that extra level of thickness nor density of Akim yet. When Akim hits this pose, even though it spreads the body thin, his amount of dense muscle doesn't disappear. You can tell from every angle that Akim is just a beast. I will give Carlos the actual tricep itself though. Not to mention he does have the more streamlined waist as well. Overall, however, I think Akim is the better combo of everything. I find him to be streamlined enough, he has more thickness up top than Carlos, and Akim has that big detail advantage. It's another close one though. If Carlos could just make some small tweaks, he's there. But right now, Akim is taking a 1-point win. In the abs and thighs, we find each guy's weakest pose outside of the rear double. With that said though, Akim's still running pretty far ahead of Carlos. It's a weaker pose for Akim, but that doesn't make it bad. I find Carlos's to actually be pretty poor. He just doesn't have the abs. The lackluster conditioning doesn't help when they're already poor genetically. This isn't a good pick for Akim either, but you can easily tell he defeats Carlos in both the abs and the obliques. Akim even brings a great thighs portion of the pose, even if you believe Carlos wins. Akim has these big, thick quads and picture perfect feathering. He's definitely more complete than Carlos since he has both aspects of the pose. And because Carlos is so lackluster in the abs portion, I think this is actually one of the more decisive wins of this comparison. I know it is a weaker shot for Akim, but Carlos's abs are just too poor to keep the score close, let alone win. I'm actually going to make this one a 2-pointer for Akim, as I see him as the solid winner here. He's the only one with both the abs and thighs portion of the pose. And finally, we have the most muscular. Once again, they are pretty similar, but the little things still add up. It looks like an evolution here between these guys, but backwards, as I have Akim narrowly taking this pose. In the lower body, Carlos is bigger and is in good enough condition to win, but because of his better condition, Akim is right there with him. Better lighting would probably help his case. They both have pretty mediocre midsections, but up top, Akim seals the deal. He wins the chest as he's thicker, but has insanely deep and gnarly looking striations. He's just taking what Carlos does to the next level. The arms might go to Carlos in this variation though, he looks a bit fuller, but for the delts, they're definitely going to Akim. And overall, you have a short, compact bodybuilder in Carlos, but a taller, denser, more conditioned bodybuilder in Akim. Both are very impressive in their own right. Carlos already has a crazy most muscular pose. A little more polish would go a long way here. It would be a 10 out of 10 pose if he could also develop his abs a little bit more. But right now, Akim is just too dense and too detailed and has an insane amount of muscle as well. So he will take a narrow 1-point win to end this comparison. Now that we're done with the mandatories, we have the second round of judging the overall physique categories. We're now looking for who is winning on 4 metrics and by how much. The categories are as follows: conditioning, muscularity, shape, and flaws. Let's start with the easiest one, condition. Akim is not the most mind-blowingly shredded guy, but he's very good at this point when he's on. And not just that, but Carlos is also fairly soft at the same time. Carlos does have good enough details from the front to coast on my generosity here though. I should probably make this a 3-point win for Akim, but as you'll soon see, Carlos needs all the help he can get. Next, we have muscularity, which could go either way because both guys are great. In terms of pound for pound muscularity, Carlos probably has the edge. While they share the same strong points, the chest, delts, and arms, Carlos has the bigger legs, which adds to his total here. But Akim is taller and he can still fill out that much larger frame and not look lanky at all. So he's a bigger guy overall, bigger on the scale if you want to think about it that way. But Carlos is a very stout individual. Overall, I did decide to go with Akim for being bigger overall and for that added level of density. Carlos is very large and compact, but his muscle still looks a little new. That's not entirely a bad thing, but when things are close, I do wish he had that extra level of density and maturity that Akim has. I could easily have Carlos winning here though, so I'm only putting a 1-point win in this category. But let's go to shape now, another narrow category, but this time I'm erring on the side of the rookie. Carlos has the better lower inserting lats and therefore has the much better flow. He also has the wider legs, so his X-frame proportions are just cartoonish. Akim really isn't bad though, he's wide up top and has a pretty small waist. Those high lats really just hinder his ability to tie it together. So Carlos is going to get a 1-point win here. And finally, we are left with the flaws category, and really I probably should leave this blank, I almost did, but I am so bothered by Akim's back, I feel that I have to voice and quantify my disgust here. I know Carlos's back sucks too, but it's purely because he's new, it lacks development. Akim's issue is more so of an injury, or so I've heard, and it hurts me to look at. I don't know why it bothers me so much, even next to Carlos's piss poor back, but it does. The high lats are also an issue for me as well, and they don't just hinder Akim's back poses. And also, Carlos needs a point, so why don't we give him one here in the final category? Alright, I'm going to just reveal the final score straight away because I immediately need to throw them out. I still do agree with the winner of this comparison, but you'll see what I mean. Anyway, winning this comparison was Akim Williams with 78.4 points to Carlos's 21.6. Yes, that is a massive difference, and no, I don't believe Akim will be running that far ahead of Carlos at the Arnold. I don't even believe Akim runs that far ahead of this older version of Carlos. This is just a slight flaw in my judging system. Overall, this is actually a very close comparison. Everything in this comparison was a 1-point win besides 1 mandatory pose and 1 overall physique category. And that makes sense, this was a close comparison because they're so similar. But because Akim edged Carlos out in most areas, that made the score way too lopsided in his favor. So yes, he has a lot of wins on paper, but they are paper thin on said paper. So I do agree with Akim winning this comparison, but the margin is way off. This is actually the closest comparison of the series so far, if you ask me. Let's go back to what I said at the beginning of this video. This is like watching the changing of the guard in real time. However, at least right now, Akim is the upgrade to Carlos, not the other way around. Those small wins Akim got throughout this comparison just added up. Plainly speaking, he's just Carlos if he was taller and sharper. They both have great side shots, great proportions in the front poses, and 0 rear doubles. But Akim has a much better overall muscle quality and condition. He was denser, thicker, and had the much better muscle maturity. And while these things are pretty small to judge a whole physique contest on, when they're so similar, those little things do make all the difference. This is also why the Carlos versus Derek talk and all the overinflation of his stock needs to cool off. But I already did that video. Carlos is realistically fighting guys like Akim, not exactly the guys that are going to place top 3 at least. Anyway, what about the future? I'm not just giving you my current analysis in this series, but also my predictions. Well, for this one, I'm actually just throwing my hands up because I legitimately don't know. This version that we used of Carlos is extremely outdated, and he's had a ton of time to improve and will be improved no doubt. If he gets just a bit sharper because they're so close, he could get that torched pass to him very quickly. Akim is more consistently shredded lately, but that's just lately. Overall, he has had issues with conditioning and peaking in the past. So if he goes back to being off and Carlos is just as sharp as he was today, that could be enough to win. Carlos may not even need to be improved. So yeah, it's completely up in the air with these two right now. I'll ultimately make a decision when it's time for my final predictions, but right now I have no clue. They're simply too similar. But I should probably err on the side of Akim, as with all of his small victories did come a larger overall victory in today's comparison. Right now he is in the driver's seat technically. He has seniority, he's a veteran of the sport, but Carlos can serve notice to a ton of guys if proper improvements have been made. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. What did you guys think of this matchup? Who did you have winning, and who do you have placing higher in your predictions? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you guys like this video, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more. And if you want to support my channel even further and are in need of some high quality supplements, then be sure to head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, use my code Project10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code Project10 at armsracenutrition.com. And finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Get Alexia.